Well, great to meet everybody, and it's good to hear these kind of backgrounds. This gives me a good sense also of maybe when we get into the writing exercises, what we'll do as far as a lot of kind of like how do you start maybe, and I'll throw in some free writing exercises just to get us all working since it sounds like some of you, this would be the first time that you are diving in to creating stories and fiction. But I thought I'd start just kind of giving you a larger perspective around this idea of speculative fiction and world building, which is I'll define my terms in a moment, and that's the genre that I work in, and how I approach story, how I approach uh, speculative fiction stories about robots that malfunction and holographic replicas of dead family members and God knows what else, kind of weird, wonky fiction. Some of the rules that I use um, when I approach this, and so I'll kind of take you deep right off the bat into speculative fiction, world building, and craft discussions, and then sort of scroll us back to how do you get started, so that nobody feels too overwhelmed. But it may be, this is some, uh, I guess, kind of trying to distill uh, a couple decades of work here, um, and the internal rules that I live by, but which I want to also mention can all be broken, right? You can break every rule I'm telling you about. These are rules that I create for myself, and I'll tell you why I use them in my fiction. And I figure we'll do this for about an hour. We'll write, then we'll take a break, and then I wanted to open it to any kind of Q&A so that we don't have to stay under the umbrella of speculative fiction or world building. We can, if you want to talk about character, dialogue, movie making, how do films, anything from, anything that you'd like, we'll do a Q&A session for the second half. Sound good? All right. So, speculative fiction, what does it mean? Speculative fiction is this very umbrella term that I define, and generally it's defined as an umbrella term that includes such things as sci-fi, um, fantasy, fairy tale, uh, magical realism, fabulism, steampunk, solar punk, dystopian fiction, you name it, all kinds of stuff. It's really just to say that it's speculating about a world that doesn't yet exist, as opposed to realism, which tends to function on a world that does exist. Now, I already want to throw in some curveballs here, some questions about this, because the magical realists have pointed out that this idea of what realism is kind of based in a sort of colonial attitude that is very Western and that believes that and is formed around empirical science and kind of Western psychology. So that the idea of angels, spirits, dead ghosts, realism has treated that historically as not true. That just doesn't exist. And by doing that, it of course is kind of just wiping away many, many cultural beliefs around the world and cultures around the world. And the magical realists were like, hey, we're only calling it magical because you're forcing us to, essentially. I mean, I'm really distilling a lot of the very high level conversations that's going on here. And I like thinking about that. I like thinking about, oh, okay, so why do we call speculative fiction speculative? Why do we not believe in certain things? Um, and why do we even have these categories? Mostly I think they exist to sell books and to help us kind of locate um, the work we're doing. But magical realists make a great point that why not, expand the notion of what is possible. Um, Now, when you create speculative worlds that we don't necessarily see every day, such as, thank goodness, I don't see robotic children malfunctioning in my house and I don't have to bury them and figure out what to do with them yet, right? Uh, when you're trying to create this, one of the things that comes up for writers is that you have to sort of reinvent the world on the page. Um, and I'll give realism this, like if I say I was walking along a Chicago street, or I was walking along the streets of Montreal, for the most part, I don't have to do a huge amount of world building yet to convince you of that fact, right? But if I say I moved into my apartment on Mars, suddenly a lot more questions may come up. Now, this isn't to say that if you're in realism, you don't have to do the very same thing of world building and making that believable, right? If I said I was taking a walk along the shores of, Lake Michigan, and I looked out at the dolphins that were jumping and frolicking playfully, any reader that is at all familiar with geography or Lake Michigan will know that I'm full of it and I don't know what I'm talking about, right? And so the creation of making things believable is this cuts across all setting and all world building. And for me, I think the question is, okay, how do I make this believable? How do I make the worlds believable without, in some ways, wasting the reader's time, I suppose, or for that matter, insulting the reader's intelligence? And I'll explain what I mean by this. If I said to you, right now, if I was like, I'm sorry, my cell phone's ringing. My cell phone is a invention that came out that replaced the landline and is a portable phone that you can use to walk around with. You would feel slightly insulted that I was taking time to break down what a cell phone is. And how this works in fiction writing is when you do an info dump. So if you say, I got into my flying car. The flying car was invented by S Corp in 2041, blah, 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 blah. And you give this big chunk of explanation, it does the very same thing. And so one rule for me in creating worlds is I'm never allowed to do the info dump. So given the rule that you're not allowed to info dump, that I've imposed on myself, because I feel like it insults the reader's intelligence, and most of all, it kind of creates a boring prose. Right? The question is, how do you hide that? And one of the places that I found is that you simply lodge the character in the world that they're already functioning with, and you give them a slight problem. In other words, if the problem is I got to bring my car in because clouds keep clogging up the engine, I'm already asking you to do a little bit of guesswork there. What do you mean clouds keep clogging up the engine? It has to do with the vapor distillation. And, when I brought it in, I also had a crack in the windshield from when I hit an eagle, which I feel awful about because eagles are endangered species, and et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm already dealing with a problem and you're already catching up. And if I say I pulled my car down into the air bay, you'll already figure that out, right? You're already doing this. And what I call this is breadcrumbs, leaving breadcrumbs or puzzle pieces that then match up in retrospect, so that the reader is allowed to be slightly disoriented right off the bat. You don't have to answer all your questions immediately. Instead, part of the fun is creating a puzzle and letting the reader and letting myself catch up with the story as I move forward. And we're going to do an exercise that'll show you how easy this actually is. Even though I'm giving you a lot of kind of my own, I guess, craft-based theory here, it's actually a very easy way to begin a story. A couple more things before we just start writing and trying this out is that the idea of world building, I think, has two parts. For a very long time, I only thought of world building as external, that it's setting based. It has to do with the weather, it has to do with the location, it has to do with whatever is going on outside of the characters. Recently, I started realizing that there's a second world building, which is the landscape inside your characters. It's the psychological makeup, it's the struggles, it's the hopes and dreams, it's the way that that character is going to see the world. It's the world that we carry within our own hearts. That's a very particular world that's been constructed of all of the joys and wounds that we have experienced throughout our lives. And it creates a way that we engage with the world around us. And so when you have these two ideas of world building, it starts to become a lot more fun than just creating an external world. And the reason for this, I think, is that often the external world that you have in a speculative story is going to affect your character. It should to some degree. This is also, by the way, true for realism. Um, we're not just, I suggest not just throwing setting into a story because you think you need to have Paris outside or rain or whatever. You were taught that you need setting in a story, so let me throw in a city. In fact, I think that the external setting often should play an active role in what the character is facing. And here, I think it helps a lot to look at fairy tale as a kind of uh, root structure, because fairy tales can help us look at all other genres in many ways. And I'll give an example. So let's say you have two kids. You've got this group. You've got the sunshine kids that are playing on the swings and the slides, and they frolic in the sunshine, right? And then over here somewhere, back in the dark woods, you have to kind of crawl under a ripped out fence where the brambles grow, or the dark kids, right? They live in the darkness of the woods. They've got, or at least they hang out there. There are cigarette butts and crushed cans back there. Okay, right off the bat, I haven't even really talked about personalities at all. Simply the setting is establishing the way that the character, that we already view the characters, right or wrong. We might be, dealing with stereotypes, etc., or expectations. But simply the setting starts to even affect, I think, the way that we think about the potential intelligence. The sunshiny kids already seem maybe less complex in some ways in their happy-go-lucky attitudes than the more complicated bramble shadow kids. And so something to note is that we as readers tend towards conflict. We're interested in where the conflict is. And I would say that, I'm taking a guess here, but automatically we're a little bit drawn more towards the shadows and the dark and crawling under that ripped fence than we are with hanging with the sunshine kids. Either story can work, by the way, just so you know, right? But now the question is, if we follow this, let's say we're following the thorny brambled kids. One question to ask is, who's going to tell the story? And something that I've found is that anybody that fits in easily with the setting is probably one of the least interesting characters to focus on. So the leader of the bramble kids that feels totally good about being a bramble kid, or whatever this happens to be, that person is not as interesting as the other kid that doesn't totally know if he's or she's supposed to be there, or they're supposed to be there, and they sort of ripped their jacket on the way of crawling under, and they hope nobody's going to see that. That character is way more interesting than the one that fits in. Similarly, the sunshine kids, the ones that are just like sliding and love the slide and they love the swing, not that interesting to me. The one that is kind of peeking over at the woods or the shadows and doesn't know if they fully belong there, or they're a little worried about that their father's alcoholism is going to leak out and they're not going to be able to hang out with the sunshine kids anymore. That character has a lot to say. And so a way of saying this simply is the character that has a conflict with the external setting is already starting to create story for you. And so one way to look when you have figured out your setting, and this, by the way, as far as where does a story start, it can start with the character as much as it can start with the setting. We're going to do an exercise that begins with the setting and then moves backwards to character, but it doesn't have to move that way. I mean, creative writing approaches however the story arrives is the way you write it, right? It may be with a visual, it may be with a character. But by following the character that's dealing with an external setting, we already begin to get story. So here's another fairy tale. You've got a city where everything is ash. All of the plants are putting out ash, and they drip dark clouds and just kind of pollution down. And everybody's houses and their sidewalks and their stoops are covered in this ash, except for one house where a character comes out every morning and sweeps the steps. Okay, already that character is of somewhat interest to us. Why does this character do that? Why are they fighting back against? Are they fighting back? Is that even what they're doing? Are they just kind of monotonously sweeping their steps every day. We're curious because they no longer fit in, because somehow they have a conflict they're struggling with, they're doing something to the environment around them. So let's zoom in a little bit. Now we want to know why they do this. So now what comes in is there's many ways you can find this out. One way is through exposition. If we were in a third person story, uh, and we'll just give this character a name as somebody want to suggest a name here? I always go for boring names for stress.
Franklin.
Franklin.
What is it? Franklin? And so Franklin is out on the steps, and we can say that Franklin wasn't quite sure why he was drawn to sweeping. It might have been to do with bringing a little bit more light, or he simply liked the way that the stoop looked before the ash began falling again. And that description already starts to sympathize this character for us, right? We already start to understand some kind of emotional resonance there. Now, that can be complicated by dialogue and by action. So here come two smog kids that run across the stoop, tracking ash all over the stoop, the clean stoop. Get the fuck out of here, Franklin said. That is going to change our feelings about Franklin completely and his internal struggle. Versus, how are you guys? He yells. Oh, okay. So Franklin isn't reacting that negatively, right? We could also have him talk to the neighbor. Why the hell do you always sweep your stoop every morning? Now we get rid of the exposition, right? Why the hell do you sweep the stoop every morning? I don't know. I just like how it looks. I feel like it brings a little more light. Would you like me to sweep your steps? I don't mind. Now, what does that mean? We start to see Franklin a little differently. It sounds like he's trying to help. He may be a busybody. We're not quite sure yet. Is he imposing his clean stepped ethos on the neighbors here in this city? We will find out through the development of the story as the story continues on. The other, again, part of what I got at was the internal landscape. We can think about what is the conflict? What's the deeper conflict? One physical conflict is obviously the smog and the ash and the sweeping. That's just a physical conflict. The internal conflict is equally interesting, right? This is the second world building. Franklin had lived in the city ever since he was born, And during that time, he had tried his best to sweep his steps, we know that, and he hoped to find someone to love. Oh, okay. Well, we're much more interested in this love thing now than the sweeping of the steps, I would argue. Oh, that's what the story is about. And somehow these two elements are going to need to work together, right? Otherwise, this is the other piece. All the elements need to somehow, in a short story, function together, because otherwise, if these are just two disconnected things and he goes to a coffee shop and meets the love of his life, we're going to wonder, well, what was all that about with the smog and the steps? Those two things have to interact and create problems. And the problems that they create, especially in a fairy tale or in a speculative story, will end up becoming metaphorical. Because if the smog is so thick that it's hard to see lovers even inside the houses, that starts to become a metaphor for how we don't see each other in life or relationships. So it's a very interesting thing when we look at speculative fiction or fairy tales of how the simple conflicts that we're dealing with start to spin out into metaphors. It's actually the wonderful thing about this. Now, another rule, am I moving too fast? Everybody good? Let's go.
Yes.
Another, and again, just interrupt me if there's any questions. Another rule that I have is that I don't want to control my metaphors. Eventually I do. Eventually I want some sense of them. I want to understand them. I don't want to control them. So I find that it's much more interesting to move along through the story without knowing where I'm going. No outline, barely a sense. It's almost me with like a little headlight making my way through this story in the first draft, in order that the metaphors can go into the surreal territory of imagination and subconscious. Because if I decide that no, in fact, I want this city to be proving about capitalism, and it's going to show that uh, the environment is being destroyed by big business, and Franklin a is an eco warrior, and his brush is made out of sustainable wood. I'm already ruining the possibilities in my. I'm already superimposing my politics onto Franklin, and now Franklin has to carry my agenda rather than having Franklin's own life. And Franklin's own life may prove not to be my agenda, which is interesting, right? That is a weird way, I agree, of approaching fiction, in that you actually think of it as though the characters themselves are alive and have their own wants. And that if I just listen closely enough, they will inform me. The result of this, by the way, is a lot of overwriting. The result of this is going down many trails and having to pull it back at a certain point. Because if you're just writing with kind of the headlamp, as I'm saying, you're going, there's mistakes, there's intuition, there's not listening to the intuition, there's deciding to go down one road. And so, as far as my stories go, I begin with writing by hand and just making a mess. And I write, and I follow the sentences, and I follow characters, and I try scenes. And I don't necessarily begin at the beginning. I begin wherever I get an image, and I will jump to the end, and it is a complete mess. But this allows me to be free and not feel the pressure of I need to write some brilliant, polished story that will get published and turned into a movie, God forbid, right? Like if I have to sit there and think that, forget it. I'm done. I'm done. I'm going to be way too nervous. I'm going to be worried about failure. I'm going to be worried about all of that. So I just explore and write a lot. Now, that's a part of that. What that's called is the writer. I just call that the writer. That's the writer part of us. The writer loves to make a mess. The writer will make a mess nonstop and enjoy it. Think about a kid when you give a stack of paper and crayons and they draw like 50 smiley faces and they're just like throwing one after the other. If you've ever had kids or seen kids with paper, they just draw like the same stick figures like 80 times. And they don't care. They don't care. And if you pick up one and you're like, oh, this is really nice, they're like, oh yeah, okay, well, this is where it's happening right now. It's like on this page in front of me, right? This is where the action is. That exuberant state of creation we all have, and that's the writer part. And that's the part I'm going to suggest we tap into as we start doing some exercises now. But I want to mention the other part. The other part, there's two other parts. One is the inner critic that'll show up and tell you this sucks as you're doing it, or why even bother? You don't know how to write, or you've never done this before, you're going to fail, or you're going to make a fool out of yourself, or this is stupid, or you don't even have good metaphors, or however your inner critic. If you don't have this, by the way, just like don't listen to any of this because it's great. Just stay away from it. But most of us have this inner critic. And the inner critic is, after all my years of working with it, I still have it every time I write. It's really just the unloved child, right? It's the unloved self in us that's afraid. It's like a hyper fear, like it's trying to protect us in the worst way possible by saying like, well, don't bother writing because you're going to fail anyway, and then you'll get made fun of. So, or you'll realize that you're stupid. And you'll realize that you're not really that verbose or have no education in literature. And it's saying all these awful things. Think of a bad parent that was like watching the kid draw and be like, no, honey, don't draw because you're going to make something stupid. like that's awful, but we do it to ourselves, right? And so what I tell the inner critic when I'm writing is, here's a credit card, head out on town, have a great time. I'm not going to do anything important here. You don't have to worry. and then I wait for the inner critic go, and then I play. Now, when the inner critic comes back, I have a discussion with that inner critic. And by the way this really functions is I'll hear it in my mind and I'll just say, thanks, inner critic. I know I'm just going to play now. I'm just going to write. Don't worry. And it'll kind of go away eventually. When it comes back, you can empower your inner critic to be an editor. And if you say to the inner critic, listen, you need to talk to me better. We need some ground rules here. You need to talk to me better. I want your insight, but you have to deliver it kindly and compassionately. And I would like your help in knowing why the story doesn't seem to be working, or I hit a dead end here. The writer couldn't figure it out. Could you tell me a little bit about craft? Could you tell me anything about where the problem is? And the inner critic is happy to become an editor and give you feedback. And at that moment, you have to make sure the writer doesn't become the wounded writer that says, "Oh no, no, no! You know, don't cut the first 5 pages." And you go back and forth between those two, and that's what I do. And then there's the slacker, by the way. The third person that lives inside us is the slacker that just doesn't want to write. That's just like, oh, I don't want to write today. You know, maybe I should call my folks or my friends. It's really hard. Writing is hard, isn't it? Shouldn't we watch some TV? And that's that like, and the slacker just needs to be kicked out. Like the slacker cannot have making no money, sleeping on the couch is not helping me at all. And so I kick the slacker out, and then I later, when I'm done with the manuscript and I've worked myself to the bone, I have drinks with the slacker and we see a movie and we hang out. We do stuff like that. Slacker's a great time, but it cannot be in the writing room with me. So those I've seen those 3 as very important parts of this whole process. So let's pause there. That's a lot of different theory and stuff, and I want to put it into just practice. I want us just to write some. Sound good? Any questions before we move into this next stage?
I wonder, Alexander, if you give your writing too freely into the process of creating, what if later on you realize the structure doesn't work? Do you scrap all the work that you've done? How do you deal with that when you realize, oh no, this is the path that should have been prevented, but because I give myself too much to creativity that I forgot to prevent myself. Yeah. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, great question. So this comes up, and this, by the way, will happen. Some writers have absolutely no problem getting lost in the woods. They have problems finding their way back, right? And so they're just kind of like out there, and and this can happen. Like the draft isn't working for some reason. And so there's a couple ways that I approach that. One way is a very basic, go back to the nuts and bolts of creative writing craft. And this is traditional creative writing will teach that a story needs conflict. So I look at, okay, so what's the conflict? And how close to that conflict did I start? Right? Did I start way too far back from the conflict? Because most short stories, the classic writing advice is start as close to the conflict as possible. Right? So if the characters are going to get lost in Yellowstone National Park, you don't start the story 5 months earlier when they're planning the trip, or you're setting yourself up for a really boring couple pages or 10 pages. No, you'd probably start with like, it's getting dark. Does anybody have a map? What do you mean Google doesn't work? That's where you start, because now we're much closer. So I'll look at stuff like that. How close to the conflict did I start? And then I work kind of from that. I'll give you an example. I struggled for a very long time with a story that I knew I wanted a double-decker igloo in it. And I loved that idea. It was going to be a double-decker igloo with staircase in it and all this kind of cool stuff. And I just couldn't go anywhere with it. I did not know what was going on. And then I started asking questions, right? And I said, okay, well, wait, first of all, what's the setting that would hold this? And here's where I say traditional craft elements. What's the setting? The setting, okay, when would that actually happen? It'd be an ice age, a new ice age, and there's double-decker igloos. Okay, and what would be the problem? A conflict, a physical problem in this would be, well, there's not going to be a lot of wood, right? So especially if everything's covered in ice, there's just going to be tops of trees. So wood is a scarcity. Okay. And that means that there's some people in single-decker igloos that are struggling against the rich double-decker igloo dude. Okay, I'm starting to get some conflict here. Okay, so there's scarcity of resources, rich versus poor, got it. Who are my characters? Well, you've got the working class single igloo people, and you've got the rich double-decker igloo guy. And he has figured out that if he takes all the wood and burns a hole down to the buried earth, he can raid everything and kind of be the owner of a lot of goods. Okay? So what's the problem? Well, one of the people in town wants to kill him because he's stealing all the wood and making everybody cold. Great. Who's my character? Well, not the rich guy. He's kind of boring. Not the killer either, because I think he's too one-dimensional in some ways. I already get him too easily. I want a character that's in the middle, that doesn't want death yet, but he also has children that are starving or getting cold, and he's going to try to solve this problem of being peacemaker between the two. And then I moved forward from there, and I wrote. That was based on conflict, character, setting. And I actually ended that story before it actually ended. And so what I then learned when I rewrote, because it wasn't quite working, was that, oh, well, what's cool about the story? This isn't a craft element. This is just like me asking, what's cool? What's interesting? Well, certainly the earth, that hole and down below is like super cool and interesting. And I hadn't taken the reader there yet. So in my revision, I then explored, well, what happens? When we get up there to the rich guy's house, let's go down into the hole. And sure enough, the ending was waiting for me there. And that's a strange way of saying it. Again, you'll hear again and again me saying, it's not exactly like I have full control over these stories. It's about me listening close enough to let the story tell what it wants to tell and figure out when I've gotten in the way of it reaching its natural conclusion or ending. And that requires, as far as practically what that requires is doing it again and again and again and not giving up and not giving up. And then eventually, sometimes with some stories, yes, giving up, because what's revealed to you when you look at it is, oh, my conflict is busted, or oh, I'm forcing my plot, or oh, I'm forcing my politics onto this, and I really just need to write an essay. That's when I then move, when the story didn't come alive because I forced my agenda onto it. It's usually when it doesn't work. Great. All right, ready to do some writing? All right. So pen and paper, laptops, however you want. I want to take us into fantasy, and because we're talking about world building and fantastical speculative fiction, I'll give you an exercise here based on this. So the first piece of this is going to be very straightforward. I want you to come up with at least 4 impossible or fantastical scenarios. And these are just like probably one sentence. I'll give you some examples. Fairy mathematics, ogre card games, moving into a first apartment on Saturn, the ability to walk through walls easily, a reality wherein we've figured out that we psychically communicate with each other all the time, and we are starting to build technology that allows us to access that easily. A society where we simply psychically talk without technology. So this is up to you. The world is your oyster here. The only rule is that you're just coming up with at least 4 impossible or fantastical or imaginative scenarios that are interesting to you. And I invite you, to, as well as think these out, you can also just put some stuff together. I mean, I'm looking right now at a lake, and I ended up with lake drinking. I don't know what that means, but lake drinking, okay. All right, lake drinking. So you can kind of just take words and put them together, too, that don't usually fit together. Floating cat, okay. The part of this is accessing that dream consciousness, that weird space we go into often when we let ourselves drift off just a little bit. For if you have a particularly scientific mind, one way that you can use this is to take a scientific truth and then make it impossible. Break some kind of scientific truth that we take to be real is a really fun way of doing this. Now look through your list, and you're going to choose one of these, right? And what's nice about having a list is if you find like you start with one of these and you don't like it, you can abandon ship and use one of the others. But choose one that you feel has some juice to it, or you're interested, or you're confused by it. Confusion is a good thing. And now identify 2 or 3 characters that live in this reality. So, for example, if I have that example of moving into the first apartment on Mars, well, obviously there's the person that's moving in, but there's also the landlord, and I guess there's probably a custodian or somebody that cleans up in this apartment building. So there's that person, and then there's the romantic partner that's also moving in, right? So you're just coming up with like 3 or 4 possible viewpoints that you can inhabit, or 3 or 4 possible characters that could tell this story. And just list those characters. If you find yourself like kind of starting to riff on them, that's totally welcomed, right? Like the janitor is a Martian, and I don't know what else. The janitor has a limp. These kind of things. If you know anything, if you're starting to gain a sense of like a picture of them, feel free to jot down a couple notes about them. And just, lightly in the back of your mind as we're doing this, you're kind of paying attention to if there's any kind of worlds or stories that are already starting to emerge. They don't have to, but they might. In order to justify one of these impossible scenarios, you might find that you have to start to create a bigger world. Just for example, lake drinking, that doesn't make any sense to me. Well, the only way that makes sense is if there's trolls that are really huge and they're going around drinking lakes, right? That's the only way that obviously you could drink lakes, but if I really want to make, that's possible. An impossible situation is big trolls drinking the lakes. In such a situation, it would seem like there's at least 2 or 3 people. There's the trolls. I'm going to give humans that worry about their lakes, that want to go swimming. And then there's like water scientists that kind of have problems with these trolls that are drinking lakes. And I suppose there's people for the Society of Protection of Trolls who like to drink lakes as well, right? So this is part of that kind of weird imagining that can start to happen. Now check out the people you have here and see if any of them speak to you particularly. You're going to focus in on one of them. And you're going to ask yourself, what physical problem, very, very basic, this is not emotional, this is just a physical problem are they encountering with the setting? This character is based on your setting. What's the physical problem? And hopefully this is clear, but a physical problem in the apartment on Mars might be like that the window's cracking. That would be a pretty big physical problem, I suppose, or that the air quality is lower. Or a physical problem for the lake trolls is for the kids is that they can't go swimming anymore, right? That's a physical problem. And just for the heck of it, give your character that you now have who's going to be dealing with a physical problem, what's the internal problem? What's the emotional problem they're dealing with? This isn't as important yet, but it's interesting if you can sense it. If you have a feeling like this guy that's dealing with the cracked window on Mars is also, I don't know, dealing with insecurity about his writing. No, let's not do that. That's too much. That's too clear. He's dealing with insecurity about his ability to be a good soccer player, because he's really put a lot into that. And on Mars, the gravity is all screwed up, so it's very hard to play soccer. What's the internal problem? If you want, you can give it something you deal with. Does everybody have enough to work with right now? Now we're going to start writing. I know we already started writing, but now we're going to jump in. So far, so good? Now, this internal problem, if you found it, by the way, I want you just to think of that as a background tone. to some degree, when I say that's going to affect probably the voice, because we'll use first person here um, as our character. We'll write in an I perspective. That said, if you feel like already you know this is a third person story or a second person story, by all means, disregard my instruction and write in that perspective. But what we're going to have this character do now is they're just going to talk about their life for a moment on the page. We're just going to try to ask them to come and talk, and they're going to talk about this physical problem that they're dealing with. And they're going to just talk about it in their regular voice. We're just asking them to come to the page for a moment and talk about, yeah, you know, the apartment was supposed to be great, but there's cracks in the window, and I'm really worried about, you know, Mars's atmosphere leaking in. I feel like I can't sleep at night. I've also been having these dreams about Earth recently. Blah, 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 blah. Onwards they go, right? So take your character and invite them to talk. If any of you have non-verbal characters, like a couch or something like that, that's super interesting. That's super fun. You've set up a really cool challenge for yourself. So how does a couch express itself? For example, is a very specific issue. And you might find, you know, either you can try that. That's some high-level postmodernism, by the way, if you need to have a couch, figure out how to speak in a couch. Or you might, that may be a reason that it's pushing you into third person so that you can speak about that couch effectively from the outside. But otherwise, give your character a voice. Have them just talk to us about the physical problem that they're dealing with and why it bothers them. And let's see what happens. And I'm just going to invite you to just write. Make a mess. Try not to stop for the next. We'll write for 7 minutes straight. Trying not to interrupt yourself. Write. Let them blabber. Allow yourself to make mistakes. And have fun. So hopefully you've gotten some weird things here. Some strange moments. Did anybody have characters that began to talk? That had something to say?
I did.
Yeah, let's hear it. Let's hear some. Super interested in hearing.
I
If
thought, like, the entire thing over it is kind of like a monologue. It's like one person talking to another, but there's no response.
Great, fantastic.
Okay.
Can we hear a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It's quite short, actually. So, how am I to purchase yet another suit? Angela, I know we're about to get the new types patented, but what is this? It's your third suit today. Can you please stop transforming back and forth into a bulldog? How can you even like those animals? How unpleasant. Have you collected the scraps? Staying silent, of course. Turkana has been discovered just a few months ago. We won't be able to travel there before official space medical trials. If we end up stuck at temporary housing on Hadidya, we're paying that. Why don't you appreciate my effort to sustainably finish off honey? If you at least collected the scraps. Oh my god, I get so stressed out as I was reading. It's so like, I don't know. And then
It's
there's
great.
a pose. Yeah. Oh, actually, the last sentence is important.
Yes.
So the call ends, and then the character says, I don't even know why I bother with environmental planet death.
It's great.
Like, environmental
Great. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and as we listen, I mean, just feel how our minds already start. Like we are super, and part of the fun of this is that like it engages you immediately. And I think like we're all like, oh, can you tell us more? We want to know more about this story, right? This kind of feel. Hopefully, if you feel that too, it starts to raise questions for you. Your text begins to be like, oh yeah, but I need to provide this part, and there's also this other thing. That's a very good feeling if you feel that, right? That's the story kind of trying to pull you forward or use you in a certain way. Let's hear some more.
Do we have to give some context about what the story is, or just read it through?
I kind of like not having it. I think it's really interesting to not have that context.
Okay.
If you feel like you must do it, but it's interesting just to hear what came out.
Okay. When I am asked to write these stories, that are usually charged with emotion and detail, I struggle to keep up with the person who is opening their life in front of me. My typewriter speeds through hours at a time, filling the pages with drama. Although my clients usually remember the events in depth and therefore gives my imagination a lot to play with, nothing I can do could bridge our minds entirely. So I must complete the stories. Either late at night or at dawn, when the first light pierces through my curtains, my memory, which fails to keep up with the urgency of the task, gives way to the artist who looms inside. One by one, unwanted details creep in.
Fantastic. Yep. And note that we really don't need that context yet, right? Like there's this is what I was talking about sometimes as writers, we think we have to do the info dump or explain, but this could very well open that story or novel. And we're catching up. We're like detectives. The reader's like, okay, therapy, got that. And what else? And we're trying to put that together. And there's no rush as long as you provide enough pieces along the way that we won't get lost. I think what's interesting to note in that piece is in that one, we don't know the external, well, we don't really know the external or internal conflict yet, but the voice is clearly very important to this. The way that the character thinks or presents things is going to be part of the conflict. Let's hear another.
So I don't know if context is important for mine, but I'll just start. Okay. So it was in April. No, March, if we can still go by our cyclical calendar. I marked down the time to March 14th, 3:14 in the morning. First, they knocked politely, asking to come in, saying they had been issued a warrant by the corpse. Seeing as arbitrary and sweeping warrants were common, I thought nothing of it. Then it began. An ever-increasing, non-repeating sound with no definite frequency and no period. I heard screams, plates being thrown out the window, wheels forged and burned, street signs taken and cut up. They went straight for the clocks, doorknobs, and by 3:17, there were no circles left.
Great. Great. And then and part of what's, this, I'm really glad that I said no context, because isn't it interesting for us as listeners to be like the detectives, right? Like we're so intrigued. It makes me think too that like part of what determines part of a writer's style or voice is how much they keep their cards or the mystery hidden and how much they're giving, right? Somebody like Kafka, for example, tends to just drop us deep with somebody waking up and here's here's somebody transformed into a bug. Oh well, like catch up, reader. You'll figure it out. And that piece has that same thing. We're learning, like, wait, why are people getting rid of circles? What's going on? But we're with you. We will read. We want to know, right? We want to find out more. Yeah, Tamara.
Yeah, okay, this is pretty short, but I'm cold and my feet hurt. M's complaining. Are we almost there? P. Not whiny, but desperately hoping. I wish I could focus on them, give comfort or acknowledge like I should, but I can't. Instead, my mind is filled with the humming of the others, like static. I can't block them, and I can't run away, though my body contracts. The road is full and the pounding follows us. Fire in ozone, no returning.
Wow. Fantastic. I mean, here's a clear conflict. We don't fully know why or what, but we're with the characters and want to know. This is a major moment. There's some real problems going on out there. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll go, if only to make the lower the bar for the person going after me. There be one. Okay. So is my mic clear?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So, rifling through my at once both tidy and hectic workspace, brushing aside loose fingers and nearly spilling my jar of spare eyes, I finally locate my license and registration. The relief is short-lived as I notice the circular stain on the heavy, expensive document paper, no doubt from some long-forgotten cup of late-night coffee. There's no time to fix it now, and maybe he won't notice. Oh, he definitely will. See, the nerve. 482 years, and this is how they still treat me. For I, the great and terrible Necromancer Salthazar, master of life and death, beholder of the beyond and snatcher of desperate lost souls, am to be audited today. And there is a non-zero chance I'll lose my license.
Fantastic. And you see a lot of people smiling, right? The voice and these kind of like surprise as we catch on to what's going on and the sort of hysterical situation here, right? It's great. Part of that, and this is again really interesting to note. Where does voice play a role in this? How deep does the voice intrude? Especially in first person. Is the voice very forward or is the voice kind of quiet? And all of that's going to develop the internality of your character. All right, one more. I know we're going a little over here, the time that I promised, but you know, I have trouble not hearing all your work. When you've written something, it's great to hear. So let's hear it one more.
Is it good?
Yes.
If no one goes, can I?
Yeah.
Okay. I know we're not supposed to preface it, but I'll preface it with I really tried, and I don't think I'm a good writer. Okay, I'm going to be nervous reading this out loud. Mountains are old. Older than the people who pretend to conquer them, older than the trees that can only sometimes live atop of them. Old as the earth itself, perhaps. With age, there is an expectation of wisdom. This pressure plagued the young alpine rebel, relatively old compared to the animal life around him, but younger than his range of ancestors and fellow colonizers of the great planet. Ever striving for an unshared gasp of the crisp air that lives higher than trees grow, mountains push against one another. The lucky ones inch higher, closer to solitude, while weaker, younger, and less fortunate members satisfy themselves with the constant patter of footsteps, infusion of root masses and plant life, and thoroughly obstructed view of the horizon and the future it bestows upon those high enough to glimpse it. My writing is so messy.
My writing as well. Just so you know, I mean, here's I can't even show you, but that's fantastic. I mean, note the voice in there, right? Sounds like a third person, which is interesting, right? There may be a first that comes out through this, but right now it's, as far as I could hear, in third. But what struck me so much is like clearly this love of nature, right? This voice of nature, this meditation on it. And part of what I want to like highlight there is like what's interesting to us as writers, as authors, as creative human beings, as simply people that are alive. What is it that really enchants us, makes us feel sad, make us feel happy, etc.? All these kind of, what is the internal life of us? That is something that I think we can hide if we're not careful. When we sit down to write, we feel like, oh, I got to write this story now, or I need to do this thing. But actually, there is no difference in between what is your imagination and your heart and what you find fascinating and the stories that you can create, right? That it's not that they should be these two separate things. Part of what I'm inviting you to do here is lean into your imagination, is lean into your subconscious, lean into something completely that may sometimes go completely unattended to or untended to in our daily lives. Yeah, fun, a little bit of something here, scary, right? Hopefully more fun than scary. Before we take I figure we'll take like a 5-minute break, but just to talk a little bit about what you just did there, right? We did 7 minutes. 7 minutes, that was all. We only did 7 minutes of writing. You created something. You all created something, right? 7 minutes. You can give yourself 7 minutes in the day. Give yourself 10 minutes. Write something. Go into your imagination. Do whatever, right? This has been how I have created my books, is that it doesn't mean that you need to have 7 hours, at my writing desk that I have created for my writing, because I am an author. No. That's never going to get. That's the slacker that's coming up with a lot of obstacles for you to never write. In fact, spending a little time and allowing yourself to explore will give you the fodder. Every story that we heard, I'm guessing that you know more pieces than that, or that you can feel more pieces, or that you're curious about something that you didn't get to talk about yet. That is the story or the novel pulling you forward. And this is part of how I write. I look for that. I look for that tooth. I look for that hook. And then I just start writing towards it. And I don't really know where it's going, but I know that if I just trust in what's on the page, something's going to show up. Now, if I really want to throw a curveball in, I'll throw something in there and see what happens. What if, suddenly we got dynamite on those mountains that I was trying to explode? That's a conflict, right? What's going to happen now? What if, we, what if all the circles disappear, for example, is another one, right? But what about, if you get kind of stuck, what about the square brigade? What's up with the square or the triangle folks in that world? You can really explore a lot of different things and give yourself these pathways to play with. And why don't we take 5 minutes, 3 minutes break, and then we'll just keep going. And any questions that are coming up or questions not related to this or etc. Sound good?
Yes.
Yeah, I think part of our challenge is, at least for me, my challenge is to resist over-explaining constantly. I should mention that, like, the other end of that is where you have total control and you know everything. Like, you've already thought about the octet novel, and so you drop the reader in like way too deep. And that happens sometimes in like hard sci-fi or something, and they'll read like, Octavia II of the Fifth Kingdom dropped the Exebulon blaster while the orb came running on 6 legs, and you're like, wait, hold on, I have no clue what's happening. And that's, I call that the deep drop. Some people can get away with that. Dune, the book Dune, if you've ever read it, does a deep drop. That's a harder thing to do, I think. And it tends to lose readers. The reader really needs to be invested to hang on there. All right, well, let's start up. I mean, we can talk about anything that any of you would like. I'm happy to just answer questions about anything we've talked about so far, or other things that we haven't talked about yet.
I have kind of a question.
Yeah.
It's a little bit related to this exercise that you gave us, and me at the beginning wondering, I mean, either a person has a really good imagination so that they're seeing a world that they've never experienced and they're just able to imagine it in such intricate detail that they can write it, or you somehow put pieces together from real life. And I'm just curious, what do you do? Do you have this world imagined inside you that you put down on paper, or do you sort of find it as you write, or do you build it from, do you have some idea that's compelling to you and you're like, oh, how can I disguise this in a fake world to explore it?
Yeah, it's all of the above in my case. So it's all of those ways. And it really depends on the story. So some stories I just get the sneak peek of them. Like, I get a double-decker igloo, and then I have to go in and like construct like what the heck's going on in that world. This happens quite a lot. I'm writing a series of tour guides that to a continent that we just missed on our maps, and so then now we've rediscovered this continent, and so it's a travel guide to these impossible worlds where hotels can eat people, and you've got destinations of loneliness where nobody will talk to you when you arrive, but everybody's having a great time. And those come about actually from an emotional state. So, I visit a new city, and sure enough, it looks like everybody's having a great time, and I don't know anybody there, and I feel lonely. And then I just write to that emotion, and I think about how would that express itself in the physical landscape. Well, the park benches that I sit on are definitely empty, and I'm definitely watching people, kissing and making out on picnic blankets in that park, and parents are happily pushing their kids and drinking frothy beers and waving to one another or something. But when I ask for directions, they turn their back, and so I just kind of explore what is the metaphor of the setting in that emotion that I'm feeling. And so that's a very magical realist way of creating this setting that's based a lot on my emotions, right? And this requires a kind of synesthesia. of figuring out what's the emotion and what does that emotion feel like? What's that emotion smell like? What's that emotion look like? Which really can only be done through art, right? In some ways, that's a very, it has to be through art that can express itself. So that tends to be how I do. Sometimes I have a agenda, or I know that I want to create a world, and then that's a little harder because I have to make sure that it's believable and that makes sense. So, for example, I'm working on a big novel right now that where America's totally destroyed. Actually, the whole world's destroyed by global warming. But down in New Orleans, a Trumpian king has taken over. And I'm somewhat limited geographically because it does still need to have some pieces of New Orleans in it. And so I can like make up stuff, but I'm also limited because I have to figure out, okay, wait a minute, there is a real New Orleans and it is connected by a river. And yes, I can mess up that river, but I got to hold on to stuff. I got to fact check myself. And so there's that truth too. That's harder. Making up a world from scratch is almost easier than a realistic world that has its rules and limitations. So it's all of those ways, in answer to your question, all those ways.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think is the role of the author in a story. And what I mean by that is, can the author put themselves into their story, kind of like a Breakfast of Champions, or is that kind of just a cute trick, or what do you think about that?
No, I mean, I love Breakfast of Champions, and metafictional moves and all of that. I think metafiction, John Barth is kind of a grandpapa of metafiction. He talks a lot about this. Metafiction is often treated like this pyrotechnic, just like messing around thing, which is ridiculous because it's kind of amazing. It's like I don't have so much of those rules in that way. Maybe what I react against as a reader is when I feel that the author's slant, bias, agenda, or cool is getting in the way of the characters, so that the characters are just set up to prove a point or to kind of like be snarky or make fun of the character without risking vulnerability or heart. I'm kind of tough about that in my own reading. Like, I don't like doing that to my characters because then I'm just like, all right, like, what am I trying to prove? How clever I am or how smart I am? And so I react negatively if I sense that beneath the surface. This is a slippery topic because who's to say that that's the case, right? I mean, I'm making some judgments about certain authors that I feel just kind of like, well, I feel your agenda, right? I feel you too much there. And so I'm trying to hide that in my own work a lot because I am a moral writer and I tend to have heavy political feelings, and I just have to constantly work against that in my own work. That said, I think writers like Vonnegut really do or Orwell do great work with politics. I mean, that's their whole thing. They've really got something to say, and I guess there's people obviously that don't like that, right? But for me, that works in those cases. I think there are people like Ishmael Reed, Colson Whitehead, I think, is a fantastic writer that has a lot of Octavia Butler's another that have a lot of agenda underneath their work, but they do it well. And I want to read, their take on stuff. So what do I think is the author's role? I mean, I don't know that I can define that. I think it really depends on the author, right? I personally feel like one of the more magical roles that an author can play is to try to be a conduit to larger stories. And this goes into like kind of the idea of, let's take something like a lot of indigenous dancing, or even voodoo speaks about this quite a bit, where you try to make yourself ready to be inhabited by the visiting gods. And so the dances your dance steps are really a practice for the moment when the gods are going to dance through you or take over and do that. And so I kind of sometimes hope that my study of craft and of sentence and of all of that is me preparing myself in some way so that when the story comes, it can take over my body and work through it without too many bumps. so that I have language and sentence structure and point of view at its disposal. But it's not necessarily something that in the first draft I'm trying to control or doing myself. There's a little more mystical of a way of approaching writing, certainly.
So you're conducting the orchestra, but you're not playing any instruments.
That's right. That's right. Very much so. And much like, I mean, music and jazz is a great example too. This idea of like, if you've ever heard a great jazz musician that's in a solo, this kind of like the notes just play themselves right, and all of it is improvisation at that moment to a certain degree. Of course, the jazz musician's dexterity has to be in place for that to happen. Um, but there's also a kind of letting go and seeing what happens. This is again writing into or leaning into that subconscious. Thank you. And just to give the caveat, that's only one way of approaching it. There are other writers that don't believe in that at all and would say that's a bunch of bullshit. And you need to like sit down and Hemingway would probably have had a lot to say about this approach that I'm suggesting. There's strong opinions out there about this, but for me, this is one of the more, I find it's more interesting that way. Do you have any advice on hating what I write? Yeah, and so it's here. Do I have advice on hating what I write? I can't get by the inner critic, and I'm wondering if time experience helps, or if I'm just going to have to learn to live with it. Well, yeah, I think you just have to learn to live with it. I hate here's my process. In the free write, I think I'm brilliant. And that's my problem. Like, I'm actually, this is so inspired. This is so brilliant. This is awesome. It's great. It's great. And then the next day, or even like 5 minutes later, I look at it and then I say, oh, that wasn't brilliant at all. That sucked. I don't know what I'm doing at all. And actually, as fun as the brilliance piece feels, it's the least useful to me as a writer, because it just like, it's actually some of the weakest writing sometimes is when I think I'm on fire. So I've learned a couple mantras. I've learned, and they're not PG, but I'll tell you the mantras I have. When I sit down to write, the inner critic shows up. I say, shut the fuck up. I need to write right now. Now, that's not that compassionate. That's not that loving to the hurt, to the wounded child within. So now I've learned to be like, that was what worked for my first collection. My second collection, I learned to say, okay, I know I suck, but I just want to write a little bit, okay? That's all. I'm just going to write today. So that's two totally different ways. And the inner critic was kind of like, all right, fine, whatever, grumble. Go ahead, write, And then with deadlines, I was like, it doesn't matter. I have to write today, right? So now I worked on this novel that's 600 pages long. I just finished the first draft. Woo! And I was like, I got to get through this. I know I suck. I don't care. I got to work today. If you're not helping, inner critic. And now I'm in the revision stage and I hate everything I wrote, but I know not to listen to that, and this is maybe the trick over time, is that you learn not to listen to that voice, because it's like, inner critic, you're not helping right now. Like, I just need some advice. If you really want to help, show me what to do. Give me some advice about the piece. But it's not throw out your novel. That's for darn sure. Then I know that the inner critic's off on a tangent. So I can say that overall this time I've learned to live with it. And yeah, that's it. I mean, and I think reminding yourself that you're allowed to play. For goodness sakes, like why hold yourself so hard when really what you want to do is play on the page for a little bit. So if you find the inner critic is you just can't get out, then give yourself a little play project where it's not going to be good, it's not going to be anything. It's just where you're going to like mess around. Not going to try to publish it, you ain't doing anything with that. Just hang out there. That play is so important to the creative. So that's the other piece, I think, about how to deal with the inner critic that I've learned.
Yeah, I have a question relating to, by the way, can you hear me well? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I have a question relating to the experience of writing a short story and then having that be brought to the big screen. And what kind of challenges you encountered during that process.
Well, I mean, for me, it was just pure joy, right? I mean, it's a dream come true. So part of how that happened is so the book comes out, and uh, because I have an agent, I also have a Hollywood agent. My agent worked with a Hollywood agent, which I didn't realize was important to ask about, but I luckily uh, didn't need to. It turned out, but really, when you're seeking an agent for your books, it's very helpful during that agent interview. Um, if you're lucky enough to have somebody that wants to work with you, then you're actually interviewing them because they're going to work for you, right? And so one question is, do they work with a Hollywood agent? That's important if you want your work to become film, to move into film. Otherwise, you have to seek that yourself. And so I had a Hollywood agent who then sent it out to a bunch of people, and Kogonada ended up, and actually it was Teresa Park, the producer, who read the story and said, I think this is great, I'm going to send it to this director. He fell in love with it. And then in many ways as an author, you don't have a lot to say. So really what happens then is they approach you and they say, we'd like to purchase it as an option, which means you can't sell this story or use it out there for any other TV or movie or anything for the next 18 months usually. We want to develop it. And you do get to have some talks or creative talks, but had I said I want to be a script writer of this, I maybe could have, I could have done that, but I don't write scripts, and I figured these directors, they know what they're doing. I hope, right? I hope that so I just put it in Kogonada's hands, and then he came to Detroit. I live in Ann Arbor, so he came to Detroit, and I invited him to dinner and cooked dinner, and we talked about what he was seeing, and he asked me some thoughts about some changes he wanted to make. And I said, those sound great. They're major changes. He totally expanded, but I could feel that it caught the heart of what I was doing in the story. And I said, that sounds great. There was another piece that he was wondering if it was, a little too cliche. I actually did think it was a little cliche, so I said so. And he said, yeah, okay, And then that was it. Then they disappeared. They disappeared and started making the movie. And I was able to go on set. This was pre-COVID, and go on set and meet the actors. And I mean, it was just such a dream to do that and see, here's Yang, the robot that dies in my story, and here he is alive, talking to me. So that was really fun. And then, as far as challenges go, I feel like there hasn't been a lot. I mean, I think as the publicity happens around the movie, a lot of it does get focused, of course, on the actors and on the directors. And, I'm just happy that they say based on a short story by Aexander Weinstein. But sometimes that can be hard because you're like, wait a minute, I created the story. Like, why is everybody just talking about, Colin Farrell or whatever, but of course that's what it is. So maybe there's a little ego that shows up, every once in a while of like, why am I not being invited on stage to talk about the creation of my story? But a lot of people don't want to hear that necessarily, and right now it's about the movie. And so being able to lean into celebrating that, I think is the piece. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, it does. Well, I just wasn't sure if you participated in the screenwriting process as well. So
yeah, I haven't yet, and my agent wants me to, right? They're pushing me. He's like, you should really write screenplays. Like you could do it. And I'm always like, I don't know. I was trained as a fiction writer. I don't really want to. I'm afraid of messing up. Here it all comes again. Here's all that inner critic, right? But I slowly but surely am thinking about like, okay, just the other night I was like, maybe I could write a screenplay. Maybe I could try. Maybe I could.
Cool, if I can go. Can you hear me well? I feel like sometimes I'm
Yeah.
also a little far. My question had to do with kind of the role of the reader in kind of the creative process. So at the beginning, I liked how you were talking about the rules that you have to kind of protect them against you like dumping information on them and that kind of stuff. But then I feel like as you went along in your explanation of how the creative process works for you, you were centered a lot more on, the different aspects of your personality. So like the lazy one, the critic, and then the writer, and also aspects of like how the characters are expressing their story and what you owe to them and to what they have to uncover. And I feel like I think the position of like the reader kind of got lost, which I thought was really interesting because for me, what I tend to go back to constantly when I'm writing is kind of like looking at the story through the eyes of the reader and like kind of wondering what are they going to think. And I was wondering if that happens for you, what you do about it, if that guides your writing at all or not at all.
Yeah, I mean, it does. Certainly there's this feeling of I want to entertain the reader. I want the reader to be like excited and surprised and engaged, and um, that's there as a kind of quiet. But I actually find that the moment I start thinking about my audience, it's actually a little dangerous for me. This is not the case for most writers. For a lot of writers I've heard talk, they talk about the audience all the time. But for me, if I'm like, oh, the readers of New Yorker magazine are really going to enjoy this, like, I'm done. Because then I'm already like externalizing. I'm thinking about the finished product before I've even done it. Now, where this comes in important, I mean, certainly, is being very aware, for example, of representation in the work. Just as an example, you take the issue of, let's say, this the Bechdel test, right? The Bechdel test, where it's like, do you have two female characters speaking about anything in your story or book that isn't based on children or men, right? That's very important. And if suddenly you then look over that and you're like, oh shit, then that's informative, right? And so I find that the politics of representation and making sure how I'm doing that is vital, and that's where the reader comes in. That's where the critic comes in with good critique. In some cases, I really need to. I'll give an example. So my first collection, I was very worried about ever writing from a female perspective because I did not want to be a man usurping female voices. And so I thought I was doing right by not writing any female characters, not characters, but like any stories in the first collection from a female perspective. But then the critique came that it's all males. It's all, these males dominating the story. I was like, damn it. So in the back of my mind, I was like, okay, all right. And I still was like kind of hung up about whether or not I should write from a female perspective. And I started writing two of the stories in the new collection from a male perspective. And as I was writing, they kept identifying as female. They kept talking about different things and I'd be like, no, come back. You're not allowed to do that. Right? And suddenly I was like, okay, let it go. And so that became the first and third story in the collection, which is from a female perspective. At that point, I do want to think about the reader a lot because I then want to reach out and make sure that I'm doing representation well because I'm writing from a first-person female perspective. I want to know that I'm not having blind spots and all of that. So I think, my answer here is that the reader shows up for me more as a critic and as a around political issues or issues of race or issues of gender or issues of gender orientation, sexual orientation rather. All of that's really important. Or cliche. That's the other place where I'm like, oh, the reader's going to think this is corny. Oh, the reader's going to think they've seen this a million times. And then I just listen. I say, okay, yeah, maybe I'm being corny right here. The writer is suffering at this moment. Maybe I'm being cliche. All right, up with the energy. Back to the writing board. Let's skip that. Cliche. So I think those are the places. But yeah, I minimize the reader for me because they're actually a little. They can be a little intimidating.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Tamara.
Yeah, well, I have a question and I'm not even quite certain how to ask it. And it's probably quite a large one, but most of my writing has been, I guess, realism as much as kind of doing kind of murder mystery type of stuff is set in the real world. And yet for quite a while now, I've been toying with the idea of something that's more on the side of magical realism, where I'm, bringing, part of it is I'm thinking things related to, empathetic powers and possibly, either, I don't know, some, and some opposite to that. Anyway, I'm still trying to figure it out, but I'm having a lot of trouble kind of making that leap from something that's very much set in the real world. And I almost don't really know where to start because it's not like setting it in a complete fantasy world or science fiction world where things, you're creating a whole world, but you're trying to to take the real world and put something in that is not, depends, we can talk about colonialism, but something that's not necessarily there and or thought to be there. And I've been stuck on this for quite a while and kind of just haven't been writing, and still it's been niggling at the back of my mind for a while.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of my work tends to be set in a world that's very similar to ours, just slightly askew. Right? And that's to some degree a real pleasure, because you already have everything in place. Like, you don't need to mess with the fundamentals and do a lot of work that is actually a pain to have to do if you're building the world from, the ground up. The question comes in, I think, about how you reveal how many pieces are you changing, right? So if we take the world as we know it, and then you start to ask, okay, so which piece am I going to change, and how believable is that? How do I establish the believability of that and not make it this big clunky thing that I need to explain the whole way through? Part of that secret for me is that the shift in the world needs to be thematically or conceptually tied to the plot itself.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think this out now, because I don't think I think of it that structurally, but like the truth is that's usually why that exists. The reason why in my story, The Year of Nostalgia, holograms exist is because the main character's mother dies and the father's going through grief, and they find out that there's a technology that can make a hologram of the mom to accompany the dad and help with the grief. Yeah. And so that's intrinsically tied. Everything else is normal. Yeah. And so really then for me to conceptualize that, I'm just like, oh, okay, so it's like a new app. It's like we learn, we're suddenly playing Wordle or whatever it's called. Like we learn these new things that didn't exist a moment ago and everybody's using it. So we're just going to come up with a name for this and then reference it and make it background rather than foreground.
Okay.
And then the question, as you move more and more pieces, I wouldn't do this to that story because it's too complicated. But in the story I just said, if as well I wanted a ravaged Earth, well, now it's getting towards novel, because that's two big issues that I've changed. Yeah. And so you always want to ask, how many pieces do I need to change and why? If you're using your realist setting and then moving it. And it can be very fun to do that. Just for example, let's say we're writing an alternate reality of America where Trump didn't win and Clinton won instead, right? That's going to change a number of pieces in the setting probably, and in certainly the atmosphere. But that will trickle down into many other places, and that's the other interesting thing. Once you shift one thing, note where would it logistically trickle down to and change.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, that helps. Yeah.
Right.
I have a question. You mentioned some of the difficulties of writing realism, or like in a real world setting, or something, or like alternate history or something. And my question is kind of about that, although I think it also extends to like fantastical settings. But often when I've tried to write fiction, I get kind of like analysis paralysis, thinking about, okay, but feeling like everything has to be correct or right, like if something falls, it has to be like physically accurate. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but kind of in that vein.
Yeah. Yeah.
Political events have to be politically accurate. If there's like some gang plot, I need to know exactly how the mafia works, So I feel like I have to be an expert in whatever I'm writing about, probably to an unreasonable degree. So do you have any advice about that or experience with that?
Yeah, this is that question of research, I think. And I fall on the side of like, I don't research. I don't like it. I don't do it. I'm like the opposite, so I actually fake it the whole way through. Like, I know nothing about technology or how it works. I just fake all of that. I was writing my novel during the height of the pandemic, so I could not travel to New Orleans. Now, yes, I could have gone through the labor of opening my computer and looking up Google Maps, but even that was too much research for me because I wanted to write. It was going to stop me. So I'm like research phobic, you know, and that allows me just to like futz it the whole way through. That has worked so far, but the problem it creates is, especially in this novel, that I got streets wrong. I totally was wrong about New Orleans. I recently went down and visited and walked the streets and did the research of what I needed and realized I had to rewrite, swaths of it. So when you fake it, you then have to go back and fix it all, which is really a pain. Um, and that made things impossible. Like I wanted certain type of geographical structures located, and it wasn't. It wasn't. I was like, oh damn it! Why didn't I just look at Google Maps before I started writing this? So, if you're the type of, and I've worked with writers that are shocked when I say this. They say, "Are you kidding? Research is the best part. This is where you find out all of the info. This is where you get your details and your language and your characters and your smells and your setting." So, if you like research, lean into it and do it. I wish I liked it more because I can see why it would be a benefit. But if that gets you stuck so that you are not writing because you first feel like you need to read every book on the Russian Revolution before you can write about it, like that's a problem because that's actually the slacker in disguise who's just figuring out a way for you not to write until you've got all your ducks in a row. And in that case, you just got to fake it and know that you're faking it and then be willing to go back and fix things. But I do know what you're talking about because I'm working on another, even though I'm working on one novel, I'm also scribbling on this other novel that is realist. It's very close to realist. The only difference is that, there's this like impending disaster to the whole planet that will wipe out the planet. So, but otherwise it's now. It's like maybe 10 years from now. And one of the things I'm struggling with is, well, did this society go through the pandemic? And how do they act? Am I going to just like skip the pandemic and pretend like that didn't happen, which a lot of our fiction and movies right now are doing, right? You see like people hanging out at the beach and stuff. And it's like, that's speculative fiction at this point. Like that's an alternate reality where pandemic didn't happen. So now I have to go back and figure out how I solve for that. And that's an interesting, realism does bring up some rules, much like any other world would too. I mean, fantasy does too. Once you've established the rules, you're kind of bound by them. I see those challenges as good. Ultimately that I got the streets of New Orleans wrong is important. When I figure that out, it's going to change the story. And so I wouldn't dispel research or dispel fact checking at all. The only time I'd say sidestep it is if it's giving you writer's block.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm interested in tension between creative writing as kind of putting on paper an urge or something that you want to express, like the purely artistic way of seeing writing, I would say, and the idea of publishing a story or something you want to convey to the reader, and that's when thoughts about the audience come in, deadlines and all that stuff. So I'm interested in knowing maybe what you think about writing for yourself. Let's say writing a story that nobody will read. Like I suppose you have written a lot of stuff that will never be published, or you don't want to publish it or share it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is where the editor. So we've talked a lot about the writer, but not the inner critic that got transformed into the editor yet, right? And so after I do this outpouring, which for me is like creating my creative cocoon for that, I really want to create a safe space for that creative soul that wants to just put all that out there. Then I have to start shaping it. And that shaping, as you're pointing out, is going to be based on thinking about the reader, and their expectations and whether I'm meeting or not, thinking about the story structure, trying to figure out what is superfluous to that story structure, being very critical about myself. I talk about not geeking out on my geeking out. So it's okay to geek out, but I don't want to geek out on my geeking out. So where am I overdoing what I'm interested in? You know, like it's one thing to have the fairies playing card games. That's awesome. But like, am I now geeking out on the rules of the card games and I've forgotten about the plot? Oh, well, I'm geeking out on my geeking out. So that needs to be cut. Even though these rules are awesome, wait till you hear them. Nope, 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 doesn't belong in the story. You know, and they call this killing your darlings or murdering your darlings as a writer. So that requires that editor that wants to give the reader an experience. You know, certainly when I like cooking as well, and back in the day when we could invite people over easily, I would cook for people. And what I didn't do was like put the ingredients all over the house and be like, it's a magical feast. Like, I organized the table and I tried to salt and figure out, does it have enough salt? And too much salt. Oh no, I guess I better start again. That's the same thing because you want to deliver an experience to the I mean, I think you can get a little lost. It's true. I've really been pushing the artistic dream world in our class today, but the other side is like not getting so lost in that you forget that there's a reader and that somebody's shown up to have an experience and hopefully be entertained and come out with that. So that process is the editing process for me, and my editing process is long. Because I make such a mess, I go through around 40 something drafts from the rough draft, and I am going through it and I'm going through it and I'm going through it and I'm removing stuff and I'm writing more and I'm reducing and I'm expanding and reducing and then, line by line by line. It's so tedious. But in the end of it all, I start to shape it. When I can't do it anymore, I put it away for a while. Then I come back and I find everything that was wrong with it and I edit that. And then I give it to my readers and I try, people that I can trust to give me feedback. And then they give me feedback and then I edit it again. And then I try to sell it, and then it gets rejected. And then 4 years later, I realize, oh yeah, that was just a practice story, right? And that's hard. But the point being that, that kind of critical vision, the ability to see your work clearly, is something that you develop over enough stories or over enough novels. So if you're a story writer, you have to write about 20 stories before you can start seeing your stories clearly, I think. If you're a novelist, you probably have to write 2 or 3 novels. And that means that you need that writer part to create a lot and to go through that editorial process. And I mean, I consider that very deeply. Obviously, it's very important to me that I'm giving the reader a beautiful experience that conveys something.
I just have a question for what is the role for metaphor in a story? Because for me, I think a good story must have some good metaphors that educates me. So what if a story is just without any metaphors whatsoever, can educate me? Is that count as a bad story?
It sounds like it does for you, right?
Yeah, you hate my story.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so into metaphor as well, so I feel like I'm biased on this one. I'm like, yes, metaphor, you need it. I'm trying to think about people that don't do that. And in some ways, how can you not? The metaphor, even if it's as meat and potatoes realism as it gets, is the metaphor is it's a representation of our lives, ideally, right? Or we're supposed to see ourselves in it. So all art seems to have some ground of metaphor. But I can imagine a story that is really trying to not lean into deep metaphors. It's about, no, this is what people go through, and it's not a metaphor for something else. It's about this very thing. I feel like I'm drawing a blank here, but I'm probably missing a swath of very important literature that's out there that does not want to deal with metaphor. It wants to deal with the facts on the ground. And we're talking about fiction. I mean, obviously, creative nonfiction and journalism tries to do that. So no, for me, I mean, again, you're talking to somebody that just loves metaphor. I can't. If the metaphor isn't there for me, I have the same feeling. I feel like I missed it somehow, or I missed the moment. I want the thing to surprise me. Of oh my God, I thought I was writing about a robot that was being buried. I'm really writing about my own feeling of losing my son and my detachment and whether or not, I judge people too hard. I didn't know I was writing about that, but that's what it's about. That to me is the magic. But are there any like meat and potato realists who say like who want to speak up about the other side of this? No. Okay. Well, metaphor is obviously king and queen here in today's discussion. We will loop back to the non-metaphor people at some at a later date here. Find out what they have to say.
I mean, I guess I could I don't know if this is non-metaphorical, but I feel like sometimes a good book can also just be to really get at the inner workings of someone else's mind, and independently of what's going on outside of that, I think that a story can be very good and there's something to be learned as well, despite it not being metaphorical. I think we're so caught up in our own inner worlds that just to have access to someone else's, albeit fictional, is something that can really be very educational for I don't know, for people. So I guess in that sense, yeah, I guess I could like fiction that isn't necessarily metaphorical in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can think of though.
That's great. Thank you. That was excellent.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. It's coming back to that editor side, and like you were talking about the fairies and the card game, diving into the rules, and maybe you don't need to go that far. But on the flip side of that, with the editor, being in that mode and overthinking and editing too much, and how do you strike that balance between, okay, this is good enough, I can move on from that section, I don't need to edit it anymore, and get away from overthinking when you're in editing mode.
Yeah, that's and also it's like, well, now I'm thinking of Tolkien, for example, who geeked out on the geeking out. It has whole books that is just deep geeking out on the geeking out. So if you're that kind of writer, then you need to lean there. This is why I say all these rules that I create for myself are just my rules. Every writer is going to, and every author has their own approach on this. I do that all the time. I over edit. I have to be careful of also the mood I'm in. There are times when I'm in a bad editing mood. And I found that that's worse than being in a bad writing mood. If I'm I don't feel like writing, I don't feel inspired, I actually sometimes can produce really good work when I don't feel inspired, it turns out. But if I'm feeling blind with my editing, so I can't see the work itself, then I cut out swaths of stuff I needed. Or I chop up sentences, or I think it sounds good, and I read it the next day, and I said, oh my God, I took out all the poetry. So that's where I have the backup copy of the old, and I go back and I pull it back. Now, usually what'll happen is something's actually wrong in the sentence. Something's actually wrong in the paragraph, but the way I'm trying to fix it is the problem. And it means that I needed to stop trying to rearrange the furniture by moving this here and this there. I actually have to rewrite the scene. I need to do something new. I need to try it again. And all of that takes, really, it's just time. I mean, what we come back to again? It's just about being patient with your work and being really compassionate with your work. I think I was just reading a thing by George Saunders that I found so it brought a tear to my eye. It's the writer is the one that's pulling all of these things out of their pocket and putting it on the table and being look, isn't this exciting? But they're kind of a little confused. This is the talent that's a little confused about what they're doing. And the editor, the self-editor, is the one that comes over and puts the hand on, that writer's back and says, hey, let's see what you got here. This looks pretty good. Let's figure out what you want, how you want to organize what you got here, And I think that's such a beautiful way of looking at what we're trying to do with our work is okay, how do we shape this? How do we find what's worthwhile? And how, as you're saying, do we know when the editor can leave? Right? Maybe this is where the slacker comes in. This is the when the slacker shows up to be hey, editor, come on, let's go see a movie, because it's already done and you're about to ruin it if you keep on. And one more, George Saunders, I find he talks about writing so well. He talks about reading and having this meter, and you want it in the positive for the most part when you're reading. but you also want to watch when it dips. And I think I've realized that he's completely right. I can feel when a story dips. I can feel when something is wrong in the scene. And then the writer part of me and the slacker team up to be like, no, it's fine. Nobody will notice. But I'm noticing. I know what's up. I know something's wrong in that scene. And so that's where I have to kind of then come back and say, okay, not get defensive about the work. Just be like, okay, something's wrong here. Let me try to figure out how to fix that. And then as long as it's in the positive, for the most part, I'm clipping along, I'm not feeling that dip, then I think one's good. You know, that's how to like finally get out of that editing trap.
Thank you. I'll try that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, maybe just as one last one before you go. There were a few of us that said that we don't write. So for me, I find it hard. And maybe my inner critic just realizes it's not as good as I would like it to be, or what am I going to do with this? But you did say at the end of the 7-minute exercise, see how easy that is? You can do that every day. So I'm curious to know what's your opinion on why should we all have a daily writing practice? What do you think it gives or adds to our thinking?
Well, you know, for the longest time, I was not a fan of like the you should write every day. I didn't do it, you know, and I felt like guilty. You know, it's kind of like somebody telling you should exercise every day. You're kind of like, all right, like whatever, keep your opinions to yourself, you know, like. But then with this novel, I ended up writing every day because I had to get it done. And I think part of what I found from this, so I've now been writing every day for 2 years. And what I found is that, like, you actually want to be present for when this magic happens. Because if you're not showing up, it's not going to happen. You won't be there to capture it. And it turns out that, like, it can show up at any time. It can show up when I'm not feeling inspired. It can show up when I thought I just wasted an hour of my life, you know? But then I go back and I say, wait, who wrote that? That's actually pretty good. Like, what was this? And I forget about it. You know, you end up producing a lot of work every day. And on a certain level, this can just be a meditation practice. You know, like if you ask meditators, like, well, what did you get out of that? What benefits can you show me the product of your meditation? That's the wrong question. You know, like so when I say you don't have to do it, if you don't feel like doing it, don't do it at all, right? Like I don't feel like learning hang gliding, so I'm definitely not going to be practicing that every day. But something in me draws me to want to write, or that I like it, or I got a little bit of joy out of it, right? Or a lot of joy. Mm-hmm. Knowing that, I have to bring myself back to it. And if I hadn't, I wouldn't have any books. Right, that's the other thing. So, like, I think you can two pieces of this. You can let go of that you need to produce anything. You can write without needing to publish, for goodness sakes, right? Like, because you enjoy it. Forget about that needs to be published. I play music a lot. I am not planning on putting out I play guitar and piano. I am not planning on putting out an album, you know, anytime soon. It would be nice, but you know what? I'm happy just jamming a little bit for 45 minutes. And nobody needs to hear that. I mean, I hope it's better that don't take that the wrong way. Hopefully it's quite nice music. But so you can also write without needing to publish. The other side, though, is if you do have those aspirations of wanting to publish, the only way that's going to happen is if you get yourself to the table and, sometimes force yourself to write every day.
Thank you. Good.
And if I can put in a note of enthusiasm, I think you should, right? Because it's clear that.
It was fun. I was just thinking if you want to say because it was fun, and just in case you capture that day when you happen to create something, it's kind of nice to think of it as a treasure hunt. Just keep trying.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right.
Well, I think first, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise and for walking us through all of this. And it was really inspirational. I found.
Oh, great.
I think I'm seeing everyone around the room nod their head. So thank you so very much for coming once again.
It's my pleasure.
Extremely grateful.
Yeah, no, me too. I my visit up there and seeing what you're all doing up there, loved. I wish I could have made it, that we were outside of this pandemic. Hopefully we will soon be, and I can visit you all again up there. Just love what you're working on and the space, and affectionately dubbed the mothership up there. So.
Well, please come anytime you like. All right, well, we wish you a wonderful evening. Hope that we see you again soon.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.